Let's bring in Keneisha Grant. She's an assistant professor of political science at Howard University here in Washington, D.C. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Rachelle.
So with the COVID-19 outbreak happening during an election year here in the U.S., how will the country keep its elections on track in the era of social distancing and lockdown and quarantine?
It actually remains to be seen. It seems like the Democrats and Republicans disagree about how they should confront this task, with Democrats suggesting that it will probably be a good idea to have governments and the federal government invest in voting by mail, and Republicans taking the position that voting by mail might end up causing some fraud among voters, even though there's not much data to support this idea that fraud is increased when we do voting by mail in the United States.
And we certainly saw the president weighing in on this. He tweeted on Wednesday saying that Republicans should fight very hard when it comes to statewide mail-in voting, saying that Democrats are clamoring for it and there's tremendous potential for voter fraud. And for whatever reason, it doesn't work out well for Republicans. Is that a fair assessment about it skewing negatively for Republicans, especially given that 22 states permit all or some elections be held entirely with mailed ballots?
Yeah, I'm not really sure why the Republicans worry so much about voting by mail. Presumably, if a person is Republican, they can also vote by mail. I think the only real explanation for this has to be that the Republican strategy depends on some voter disenfranchisement, depends on keeping some people who might not otherwise vote. I'm thinking about young people or poor people or people who have limited mobility from getting to the polls. But we don't have any evidence that supports the president's claim about voter fraud being more likely because of mail-in voting.
Now, despite efforts to sort of remove the in-person voting in Wisconsin, we saw that there were the restrictions in place, though, for travel and social distancing, but the Supreme Court of the U.S. recently raised some eyebrows. Help us understand the reasoning and the dissenting opinion for allowing in-person voting in the Wisconsin primary and perhaps the precedents that it sets for other primaries going forward.
I think that's exactly the concern. The court is worried about what this might mean in terms of precedent for elections moving forward. And I think that it's one thing to be trying to sort through what happens with primary elections, but I don't think they want to have a decision that paves the way for making a decision, a long-term decision about what will happen with those federal elections. And so I think that we should expect to see that there will be some back and forth between the states, both in this primary election and in the general election, and that this will come back before the court later once we have more information about the different ways that we could participate.
So then with this sort of dissonance between some of the states, what effect do you think the pandemic could have on the outcome of elections, especially if people are still under social distancing restrictions come November?
I'm thinking about the social distancing restrictions, but I'm also thinking about the likelihood that more Americans might be sick as we go further into the summer. We don't seem to know where the peak is going to be for many places, and it looks like it's going to be different from place to place. And so I'm worried about the social distancing, but also worried about just a general lack of voter turnout as people themselves start to get sick or they start to have to be worried about other people in the society who are sick. But I think the biggest thing that we should be worried about as people who care about the democracy is the decrease in the overall turnout, and what that decrease in the overall turnout means for either of the political parties and whether it preferences one party over the other.
And we certainly saw the race narrowing now with Senator Bernie Sanders officially ending his presidential campaign. So what should we be watching for between now and November, especially under the shadow of COVID-19?
I think in terms of just thinking about the policy, one of the big things that I'm interested to see is who Joe Biden will choose for his vice presidential nominee. He's made some rumblings about believing that the vice president should be a woman. It remains to be seen whether she'll be a woman of color or a woman governor or some other kind of variation. So I'm interested to see how that'll turn out. I'm also interested to see what Bernie Sanders' position will be moving forward in this election. In 2016, many of the people who supported his campaign did not turn out for Hillary Clinton. And a part of the reason that folks believe that happened was that Bernie Sanders was not forceful in his support of her. And so I'm interested to see whether he will be forceful in his support of Joe Biden. I'm interested to see where Elizabeth Warren will be and how and whether folks will be able to unify this party as they move forward into November.
And very quickly, we have about 15 seconds. How have voters' priorities changed, if at all, in light of the pandemic?
I think they've changed a lot. I think Americans are looking for leadership and looking for decisive leadership and thinking about this in that term and thinking about it in terms of our economy.
All right, thank you so much for your insights. Keneisha Grant there, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Howard University.